while these activities are taking place, there is no outstanding U.S. complaint. The day before Hussein invades Kuwait, the State Department is lobbying Congress not to apply any economic sanctions to Iraq for its growing border threats. The next day, Hussein did what he threatened to do. Now George Bush is sending upwards to 250,000 U.S. troops to the Persian Gulf. In the light of all this, a question keeps running through my mind. Is anyone actually willing to die for a foreign policy apparently designed and conducted by the Three Stooges? Well, Bush calls Hussein a Hitler and a madman, and Hussein says Bush went crazy overnight. There's enough insanity to go around, but just because the policies are in any human terms insane, it doesn't mean they lack a logic. And what we need to do is to find that logic if we are ever going to successfully resist it. I believe that that logic is in part an old story, the logic of our policies, our insane policies in the Middle East. The old story is this: it's the use of U.S. military power, to direct or indirect military power, anywhere in the third world, to maintain for U.S. corporate interests cheap raw materials, cheap labor, markets. This explains our murderous policies in El Salvador, our terrorism in Nicaragua, the war in Vietnam, about which Dan Ellsberg would tell you if he were here, we weren't on the wrong side. We were the wrong side. We are up to our ears in the Gulf because of raw materials. The Gulf has oil. That's the old logic. But there's a new twist. In March of this year, Defense Secretary Cheney said, quote, "We're willing to put U.S. troops on the ground. The message is that Americans are willing to risk their lives to ensure the security of our friends and allies." Security and the implied interests, raw material interests of our friends and allies. The logic is now being stretched, the old logic to self-appoint the United States war machine as policeman of the world, to protect the interests of multinational corporate power everywhere in the third world. With the collapse of a feasible Soviet threat, how can our military-industrial complex be rationalized and maintained? There is all of this threatening talk of a peace dividend. There are those who talk of investing the hundreds of billions of dollars heretofore committed each year to the U.S. war machine, to useful science, to technology, to the environment, to trade development, to deficit reduction, to education, to housing the homeless, to feeding the hungry. It's dangerous talk. It is now silenced by the winds of war. On Tuesday of this week, top Democratic leaders added $5.3 billion to the Pentagon budget and began looking for further cuts into the domestic budget. The same day, by the way, the Washington Post carried the latest report on the Northrop Corporation scandal. That's the corporation that has a $63 billion contract to build the B-2 bomber. That's the invisible bomber without a mission that doesn't work. And many other expensive programs. The report cited the, quote, collapse of every aspect of management, unquote. Northrop can't account for the costs of anything, but it's still receiving huge chunks of Pentagon monies. And why not? Pentagon budget isn't about things. It isn't even about weapons that work. Note that the Huey helicopters and the F-16s are falling left and right in the Persian Gulf. It's about the transfer of wealth from the people to certain elements, the industrial, military elements of the corporate elite. And Northrop management is very, very effective at that. So the old, new logic becomes clear. Maybe we should never expect that a 40-year-old industrial complex of almost incomprehensible wealth, of almost incomprehensible power, now standing alone in that power in the entire world. It might be too much to expect that it would simply fold its tent and gracefully retire, while the United States got on about the business of creating a decent society, if not a great one. It will search for a new rationale. How helpful to that rationale was Saddam Hussein? How useful to it was he? I believe it's fortunate that the UN almost instantly backed the US policy. I think it's fortunate that the bulk of the Arab world, and indeed almost all of the world, was quick to back the US involvement, or at least to join in condemning Saddam Hussein, to putting the world with us. Because given all the hawk talk about removing Hussein, surgical strikes, massive preemptive invasions, it's good the world is there to deter us, as well as Saddam Hussein. We have a kind of choice, I believe. We, I mean America, all of us. Choosing the direction. We can support the UN as the only world cop to be supported. We can cooperate with the other involved parties to ensure a decent, negotiated Middle East peace, peace which will end the destruction of Lebanon, peace which brings justice at long last to the Palestinians, sufficient security to Israel. Or we can take the path that our hawks are screaming for. Bloodshed now before it's too late. Bloodshed now before the world clamps us down. I'm very worried about the possibilities of some dramatic event occurring which will justify the shedding of blood, and once the bloodshed starts, it's so hard to stop the flow. Well, we can take that path. We can abandon the role of self-appointed world cop. Maybe we can, in fact, begin the journey to a new world order, a world ruled by concepts of peace and justice and ordinary human decency under the auspices of international law and the United Nations. That won't be easy to do, to make that shift from the path we're currently on. The drums of war beat loud against the softer songs of peace. But it's the only trip worth taking. And I would hope that this teaching is one of the hopefully many small steps that will be taken now and in the immediate future to start that journey.